Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 2 of The Magicians. So let's get into it. Chapter 2, Breakbills. He didn't laugh. Quentin would appreciate that later. Upstate, Quentin said. What, like Vassar? I saw you come through, the young man said. Come on, you need to go up to the house. He snapped the cigarette away and set off across the wide lawn. He didn't look back to see if Quentin was following, which, at first, Quentin didn't. But then a sudden fear of being left alone in this place got him moving, and he trotted to catch up. The green was enormous, the size of half a dozen football fields. It seemed to take them forever to get across it. The sun beat on the back of Quentin's neck. So what's your name? The young man asked, in a tone that made sure Quentin knew that he had no interest in the answer. Quentin. Charming. From? Brooklyn. How old? 17. I'm Elliot. Don't tell me anything else. I don't want to know. Don't want to get attached. Quentin had to take a couple of double-time steps to keep up with Elliot. There was something off about Elliot's face. His posture was very straight, but his mouth was twisted to one side in a permanent half-grimace that revealed a nest of teeth sticking both in and out at impossible angles. He looked like a child who had been slightly misdelivered, with some subpar forceps handling by the attending. But despite his odd appearance, Elliot had an air of effortless self-possession that made Quentin urgently want to be his friend, or maybe just be him, period. He was obviously one of those people who felt at home in the world. He was naturally buoyant, where Quentin felt like he had to dog paddle constantly, exhaustingly, humiliatingly, just to get one sip of air. So what is this place? Quentin asked. Do you live here? You mean here at Brakebills? He said airily. Yes, I guess I do. They had reached the far side of the grass. If you can call it living. Elliot led Quentin through a gap in a tall hedge and into a leafy, shadowy labyrinth. The bushes had been trimmed precisely into narrow, branching, frantically ramifying corridors that periodically opened out onto small, shady alcoves and courtyards. The shrubbery was so dense that no light penetrated through it, but here and there a heavy yellow stripe of sun fell across the path from above. They passed a plashing fountain here, a somber, rain-ravaged white stone statue there. It was a good 5 minutes before they stepped out of the maze through an opening flanked by two towering topiary bears, reared up on their hind legs onto a stone terrace in the shadow of the large house Quentin had seen from a distance. A breeze made one of the tall, leafy bears seem to turn its head slightly in his direction. The dean will probably be down to get you in another minute, Elliot said. Here's my advice. Sit there. He pointed to a withered stone bench, like he was telling to an overly affectionate dog to stay. And try to look like you belong here, and if you tell him you saw me smoking, I will banish you to the lowest circle of hell. Which, I've never been there, but if even half of what I hear is true, it's almost as bad as Brooklyn. Elliot disappeared back into the hedge maze, and Quentin sat down obediently on the bench. He stared down between his shiny black interview shoes at the gray stone tiles, his backpack and his overcoat in his lap. This is impossible, he thought lucidly. He thought the words in his mind, but they got no purchase on the world around him. He felt like he was having a non-unpleasant drug experience. The tiles were intricately carved with a pattern of tiny vines, or possibly elaborately calligraphic words that had been worn away into illegibility. Little motes and seeds drifted around in the sunlight. If this is a hallucination, he thought, it's pretty damn high res. The silence was the strangest part of it. As hard as he listened, he couldn't hear a single car. It felt like he was in a movie where the soundtrack had abruptly cut out. A pair of French doors rattled a few times and then opened. A tall, fat man, wearing a seersucker suit, strode out onto the terrace. "Good afternoon," he said. "You would be Quentin Coldwater?" He spoke very correctly, as if he wished he had an English accent, but wasn't quite pretentious enough to affect one. He had a mild, open face and thin, blonde hair. "Yes, sir." Quentin had never called an adult or anybody else sir in his life, but it suddenly felt appropriate. "Welcome to Brakebills College," the man said. "I suppose you've heard of us?" "Actually, no," Quentin said. "Well, you've been offered a preliminary examination here. Do you accept?" Quentin didn't know what to say. This wasn't one of the questions he'd prepped for when he got up this morning. "I don't know," he said, blinking. I guess. I'm not sure." Perfectly understandable response, but not an acceptable one, I'm afraid. I need a yes or a no. It's just for the exam, he added helpfully. Quentin had a powerful intuition that if he said no, all of this would be over before the syllable was even fully out of his mouth, and he would be left standing in the cold rain and dog shit of First Street, wondering why he'd seemed to feel the warmth of the sun on the back of his neck for a second just then. He wasn't ready for that. Not yet. "Sure, okay," he said, not wanting to sound too eager. "Yeah." "Splendid." He was one of those superficially jolly people whose jolliness didn't quite reach all the way up to his eyes. "Let's get you examined. My name is Henry Fogg. No jokes, please. I've heard them all. And you may address me as Dean. Follow me. You're the last one to arrive, I think," he added. No jokes actually came to Quentin's mind. Inside the house it was hushed and cool, and there was a rich, spicy smell in the air of books and oriental carpets and old wood and tobacco. The dean walked ahead of him impatiently. It took Quentin a minute for his eyes to adjust. They hurried through a sitting room hung with murky oil paintings, down a narrow wood-paneled hallway, then up several flights of stairs to a heavy timbered wooden door. The instant it opened, hundreds of eyes flickered up and fixed themselves on Quentin. The room was long and airy and full of individual wooden desks arranged in rows. At each desk sat a serious-looking teenager. It was a classroom, but not the kind Quentin was used to, where the walls were cinder block and covered with bulletin boards and posters with kittens hanging from branches with "Hang in there, baby" under them in balloon letters. The walls of the room were old stone. It was full of sunlight, and it stretched back and back and back. It looked like a trick with mirrors. Most of the kids were Quentin's age and appeared to occupy his same general stratum of coolness or lack thereof, but not all. There were a few contingent, and one of those super Jews, a hazard. A too-tall girl with two big red-framed glasses beamed goofily at everybody. A few of the younger girls looked like they'd been crying. One kid had no shirt on and green and red tattoos all over his back. Jesus, Quentin thought. Whose parents would let them do that? Another was in a motorized wheelchair. Another was missing his left arm. He wore a dark button-down shirt with one sleeve folded up and held closed with a silver clasp. All the desks were identical, and on each one an ordinary blank blue test booklet was laid out with a very thin, very sharp number 3 pencil next to it. It was the first thing Quentin had seen here that was familiar. There was one empty seat toward the back of the room, and he sat down and scooched his chair forward with a deafening screech. He almost thought he saw Julia's face in among the crowd, but she turned away almost immediately. And anyway, there was no time. At the front of the room, Dean Fogg cleared his throat primally. "All right," he said. A few preliminaries. There will be science during the examination. You are free to look at other students' papers, but you will find that they appear to you to be blank. Your pencils will not require additional sharpening. If you would like a glass of water, just hold up 3 fingers above your head, like this. He demonstrated. Do not worry about feeling unprepared for the examination. There is no way to study for it, though it would be equally true to say that you have been preparing for it your whole lives. There are only 2 possible grades, pass and fail. If you pass, you will proceed to the second stage of the examination. If you fail, and most of you will be returned to your homes with a plausible alibi and very little memory of this entire experience. The duration of the test is 2½ hours. Begin. The dean turned to the blackboard and drew a clock face on it. Quentin looked down at the blank booklet on his desk. It was no longer blank. It was filling with questions. The letters literally swam into being on the paper as he watched. The room filled with a collective rustling of paper, like a flock of birds taking off. Heads bowed in unison. Quentin recognized this motion. It was the motion of a bunch of high-powered Type A test killers getting down to their bloody work. That was all right. He was one of them. I'm gonna move real quick. Get a little more comfy. Quentin hadn't planned on spending the rest of his afternoon or morning or whatever this was, taking a standardized test on an unknown subject at an unknown educational institution in some unknown alternate climate zone where it was still summer. He was supposed to be in Brooklyn freezing his ass off and being interviewed by some random senior citizen currently deceased. But the logic of his immediate circumstances was overwhelming his other concerns, however well-founded they might be. He had never been one to argue with logic. A lot of the test was calculus. Pretty basic stuff for Quentin, who was so mysteriously good at math that his high school had been forced to outsource that part of his education to Brooklyn College. Nothing more hazardous than some fancy differential geometry and a few linear algebra proofs. But there were more exotic questions, too. Some of them seemed totally pointless. One of them showed him the back of a playing card. Not an actual card, but a drawing of the back of a playing card, mind you, featuring your standard twin angels riding bicycles, and asked him to guess what card it was. How did that make sense? Or later on, the test gave him a passage from The Tempest, then asked him to make up a fake language, and then translate the Shakespeare into the made-up language. He was then asked questions about the grammar and orthography of his made-up language, and then, honestly, what was the point? Questions about the made-up geography and culture and society of the made-up country where his made-up language was so fluently spoken. Then he had to translate the original passage from the fake language back into English, paying particular attention to any resulting distortions in grammar, word choice, and meaning. Seriously. He always gave everything he had on tests, but in this case, he wasn't totally sure what he was supposed to give. The test also changed as he took it. The reading comprehension section showed him a paragraph that vanished as he read it, then quizzed him on its contents. Some new kind of computerized paper. Hadn't he read somewhere that somebody was working on that? Digital ink? Amazing resolution, though. He was asked to draw a rabbit that wouldn't keep still as he drew it. As soon as it had its paws, it scratched itself luxuriously, and then went hopping off around the page, nibbling at the other questions so that he had to chase it with the pencil to finish filling in the fur. He wound up pacifying it with some hastily sketched radishes, and then drawing a fence around it to keep it in line. Soon he forgot about everything else except putting a satisfactory chunk of his neat handwriting next to one question after another, appeasing whatever perverse demands the test made of him. It was an hour before he even looked up from his desk. His ass hurt. He shifted in his chair. The patches of sunlight from the windows had moved. Something else had changed too. When he'd started, every single desk had been filled, but now there was a sprinkling of empty ones. He hadn't noticed anybody leaving. A cold crystal seed of doubt formed in Quentin's stomach. Jesus, they must have finished already. He wasn't used to being outclassed in the classroom. The palms of his hands prickled with sweat, and he smeared them along his thighs. Who were these people? When Quentin flipped to the next page of the test booklet, it was blank except for a single word in the center of the page. Finn, in swirly italic type, like at the end of an old movie. He sat back in the chair and pressed the heels of his aching hands against his aching eyes. Well, that was 2 hours of his life he'd never get back. Quentin still hadn't noticed anybody getting up and walking out, but the room was getting seriously depopulated. There were maybe 50 kids left, and more empty desks than full ones. It was like they were softly and silently slipping out of the room every time he turned his head. The punk with the tattoos and no shirt was still there. He must have finished, or given up, because he was dicking around by ordering more and more glasses of water. His desktop was crowded with glasses. And Quentin spent the last 20 minutes staring out the window and practicing a spinning trick with his pencil. The dean came in again and addressed the room. I'm delighted to inform you all that you will be moving on to the next stage of testing, he said. This stage will be conducted on an individual basis by members of the Brakebills facility. In the meantime, you may enjoy some refreshment and converse among yourselves. Quentin counted only 22 desks still occupied, maybe a tenth of the original group. Bizarrely, a silent, comically correct butler in white gloves entered and began circulating through the room. He gave each of them a wooden tray with a sandwich, roasted red peppers and very fresh mozzarella on sourdough bread, a lumpy pear, and a thick square of dark, bitter chocolate. He poured each student a glass of something cloudy and fizzy from an individual bottle without a label. It turned out to be grapefruit soda. Quentin took his lunch and drifted up to the front row, where most of the rest of the test takers were gathering. He felt pathetically relieved to have gotten this far, even though he had no idea why he'd passed and the others had failed, or what he'd get for passing. The butler was patiently loading and clinking, sloshing collection of water glasses from the punk's desk onto a tray. Quentin looked for Julia, but either she hadn't made the cut or she'd never been there in the first place. They should have capped it, explained the punk, who said his name was Penny. He had a gentle, moony face that was at odds with his otherwise terrifying appearance. How much water you can ask for? Like maybe 5 glasses at most. I love finding shit like that, where the system screws itself with its own rules. He shrugged. Anyway, I was bored. The test told me I was done after 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Quentin was torn between admiration and envy. Jesus Christ, it took me 2 hours. The punk shrugged again and made a face. What the hell do you want me to say? Among the test takers, camaraderie warred with mistrust. Some of the kids exchanged names and hometowns and cautious observations about the test. Though the more they compared notes, the more they realized that none of them had taken the same one. They were from all over the country, except for 2 who turned out to be from the same Inuit reservation in Saskatchewan. They went around the room telling stories about how they'd gotten here. No 2 were exactly the same, but there was always a certain family resemblance. Somebody went looking for a lost ball in an alley, or a stray goat in a drainage ditch, or followed an inexplicable extra cable in the high school computer room, which led to a server closet that had never been there before, and then green grass and summer heat and somebody to take them up to the exam room. As soon as lunch was over, teachers began poking their heads in and calling out the names of candidates. They went alphabetically, so it was only a couple of minutes before a stern woman in her 40s with dark shoulder-length hair summoned Quentin Coldwater. He followed her into a narrow wood-paneled room with tall windows that looked out from a surprisingly great height onto the lawn he'd crossed earlier. Chatter from the adjacent exam room cut off abruptly when the door closed. Two chairs faced each other across a worn, hugely thick wooden table. Quentin felt giddy, like he was watching the whole thing on TV. It was ridiculous, but he forced himself to pay attention. This was a competition, and he dominated competitions. That was what he did, and he sensed that the stakes of this one were rising. The table was bare except for a deck of cards and a stack of about a dozen coins. "I understand you like magic tricks, Quentin," the woman said. She had a very slight accent. European, but otherwise unplaceable. Icelandic? "Why don't you show me some?" As a matter of fact, Quentin did like magic tricks. His interest in magic had started 3 years ago, partly inspired by his reading habits, but mostly as a way of fattening up his extracurriculars with an activity that wouldn't force him to actually interact with other people. Quentin had spent hundreds of emotionally arid hours with his iPod on palming coins and shuffling cards and producing fake flowers from skinny plastic canes in a trance of boredom. He watched and rewatched grainy porn-like instructional videotapes in which middle-aged men demonstrated close-up magic passes in front of backdrops made of bedsheets. Magic, Quentin discovered, wasn't romantic at all. It was grim and repetitive and deceptive, and he worked his ass off and became very good at it. There was a store near Quentin's house that sold magic supplies, along with junk electronics, dusty board games, pet rocks, and fake vomit. Ricky, the man behind the counter, who had a beard and sideburns but no mustache, like an Amish farmer, grudgingly agreed to give Quentin some tips. It wasn't long before the student surpassed the master. At 17, Quentin knew the scotch and soda and the tricky one-handed charlier cut, and he could juggle the elusive Mills mess pattern with 3 balls and sometimes, for short ecstatic flights, with 4. He earned a small dividend of popularity at school every time he demonstrated his ability to throw, with a fierce robotic accuracy, an ordinary playing card sidearm, so that from a distance of 10 feet it stuck edge on in one of the flavorless styrofoamy apples they served in the cafeteria. Quentin reached for the cards first. He was vain about his shuffling, so he broke out a faro shuffle rather than the standard rifle just in case. Fat chance. The woman sitting across from him knew the difference, and how ridiculously hard it was to do a good faro. He ran through his usual routine, which was already calculated to show off as many different skills as possible. False cuts, false shuffles, lifts, sleights, passes, forces. In between tricks, he tossed and waterfalled and avalanched the cards from hand to hand. He had regular patter to go with it, but it sounded clumsy and empty in the quiet, airy, beautiful room, in front of this dignified, handsome older woman. The words trailed off. He performed in silence. The cards made shushing, snapping noises in the stillness. The woman watched him steadily, obediently choosing a card whenever he asked her to, showing no surprise when he recovered it, against all odds, from the middle of a thoroughly shuffled deck, or from his shirt pocket, or out of thin air. He switched to the coins. They were fresh new nickels, nicely milled, good crisp edges. He had no props, no cups, or folded handkerchiefs, so he stuck to palms and passes, flourishes and catches. The woman watched him in silence for a minute, then reached across the table and touched his arm. "Do that one again," she said. He obediently did that one again. The trick was an old one, the wandering nickel, wherein a nickel, actually 3 nickels, moved mysteriously from hand to hand. He kept showing it to the audience and then cheekily vanishing it again. Then he pretended to lose track of it entirely. Then he triumphantly produced it again, whereupon it appeared to vanish again straight out of his open palm, in plain sight. It was actually a fairly ordinary, if well scripted, sequence of steals and drops, with one particularly nervy retention of vision vanish. "Do it again." He did it again. She stopped him in the middle. "This part. There is a mistake." "Where?" He frowned. "That's how you do it." She pursed her lips and shook her head. The woman plucked 3 nickels from the stack, and without an instant of hesitation or anything in her manner that acknowledged that she was doing something special, performed the wandering nickel perfectly. Quentin couldn't stop staring at her small, limber brown hands. Her movements were smoother and more precise than any professional's he'd seen. She stopped in the middle. "See here, where the second coin must go from hand to hand? You need a reverse pass, holding it like so. Here, come around so you can see." He obediently trotted around to her side of the table and stood behind her, trying not to look down her blouse. Her hands were smaller than his, but the nickel vanished between her fingers like a bird into a thicket. She did the move for him slowly, backward and forward, breaking it down. "That's what I'm doing," he said. "Show me." Now she was openly smiling. She grasped his wrist to stop him mid-pass. "Now, where is the second coin?" He held out his hands, palm up. The coin was... But there was no coin. It was gone. He turned his hands over, waggled his fingers, looked on the table, in his lap, on the floor. Nothing. It had disappeared. Did she nick it while he wasn't looking? With those fast hands and that Mona Lisa smile, he couldn't quite put it past her. "It is what I thought," she said, standing up. "Thank you, Quentin. I will send in the next examiner." Quentin watched her go, still patting his pockets for the missing coin. For the first time in his life, he couldn't tell if he'd passed or failed. The whole afternoon went like that. Professors parading in through one door and out the other. It was like a dream, a long, rambling dream with no obvious meaning. There was an old man with a shaky head who fumbled in his pants pockets and threw a bunch of frayed, yellow-knotted cords on the table, then stood there with a stopwatch as Quentin untied them. A shy, pretty young woman, who looked like she was barely older than Quentin, asked him to draw a map of the house and the grounds based on what he'd seen since he'd been there. A slick fellow with a huge head and who wouldn't or couldn't stop talking challenged him to a weird variant of blitz chess. After a while, you couldn't even take it seriously. It felt like it was his credulity that was being tested. A fat man with red hair and a self-important air released a tiny lizard with iridescent hummingbird wings and huge, alert eyes into the room. The man said nothing, just folded his arms and sat on the edge of the table, which creaked unhappily under his weight. For lack of a better idea, Quentin tried to coax the lizard to land on his finger. It flew down and nipped a tiny chunk out of his forearm, drawing a dot of blood, then zipped away and buzzed against the window like a bumblebee. The fat man silently handed Quentin a Band-Aid, collected his lizard, and left. Finally, the door closed and didn't open again. Quentin took a deep breath and rolled his shoulders. Apparently, the procession had ended. Though nobody bothered to say anything to Quentin. At least he had a few minutes to himself. By now the sun was setting. He couldn't see it from the exam room, but he could see a fountain, and the light reflected in the pool of the fountain was a cool, burnt orange. A mist was rising up through the trees. The grounds were deserted. He rubbed his face with his hands. His head was clearing. It occurred to him, long after it probably should have, to wonder what the hell his parents were thinking. Normally, they were pretty indifferent to his comings and goings, but even they had their limits. School had been out for hours now. Maybe they thought that his interview had run long, though the chances that they even remembered Quentin was supposed to have had an interview were pretty small. Or if it was summer here, maybe school hadn't even started yet. The giddy haze he'd been lost in all afternoon was starting to dissipate. He wondered exactly how safe he was here. If this was a dream, he was going to have to wake up pretty soon. Through the closed door, he distinctly heard the sound of somebody crying. A boy, and way too old to be crying in front of other people. A teacher was speaking to him quietly and firmly, but the boy either wouldn't or couldn't stop. He ignored it, but it was a dangerous, unmanning sound, a sound that clawed away at the outer layers of Quentin's hard-won teenage sang-froid. Underneath it, there was something like fear. The voices faded as the boy was led away. Quentin heard the dean speaking in icy, clipped tones, trying not to sound angry. "I'm really not sure I care one way or the other anymore." There was an answer, something inaudible. "If we don't have a quorum, we'll simply send them all home and skip a year." Fogg's genteel reserve was decaying. "Nothing would make me happier. And we can rebuild the observatory. We can turn the school into a nursing home for senile old professors. God knows we have enough of those." Inaudible. "There's a 12th. Melanie. We go through this there's a 12th, Melanie. We go through this every year, and we will empty every high school and middle school and juvenile detention center till we find him or her in it. And if there isn't, I will happily resign, and it will be your problem, and you're welcome to it. Right now, I can't think of anything that would make me happier." The door opened a crack, and for an instant a worried face peered in at him. It was Quentin's first examiner, the dark-haired European lady with the clever fingers. He opened his mouth to ask about a phone. His cell was down to one useless freaking bar. But the door shut again. How annoying. Was it over? Should he just leave? He made a face to himself. He was all for adventures, God knows, but enough was enough. This one was getting old. The room was almost dark. He looked around for a light switch, but there wasn't one. In fact, all the time he'd been there, he hadn't seen a single electrical device. No phones, no lights, no clocks. It was a long time since Quentin had had his sandwich and his square of dark chocolate, and he was hungry again. He stood up and went to the window where it was lighter. The panes of glass were wiggly with age. Was he the last one left? What was taking so long? The sky was a luminous royal blue dome, swarming with huge lazy whirls of stars. Van Gogh stars that would have been invisible in Brooklyn, drowned in light pollution. He wondered how far upstate they were, and what had happened to the note he'd been chasing and never found. The book he'd left behind with his backpack in the first exam room. Now he wished he'd kept it with him. He imagined his parents making dinner together in the kitchen, something steaming on the stove. His dad singing along to something nightmarishly unhip. 2 glasses of red wine on the counter. He almost missed them. With no warning, the door banged open and the dean walked in, talking over his shoulder at somebody behind him. "A candidate? Fine," he said sarcastically. "Let's see a candidate. And bring some goddamned candles." He sat down at the table. His shirt was translucent with sweat. It was not impossible that he'd had a drink, but between now and the last time Quentin had seen him. "Hello, Quentin. Please sit." He indicated the other chair. Quentin sat, and Fogg rebuttoned his top button and hastily, irritably, whipped a tie out of his pocket. The dark-haired woman followed Fogg into the room, and after her came the old man with the knots, the fat man with the lizard, then the rest of the dozen or so men and women who had paraded through the room this afternoon. They formed lines along the walls, packed themselves into the corners, craning to look at him, whispering to one another. The punk kid with the tattoos was there too. He slipped in just as the door was closing, unobserved by the faculty. Come on, the dean waved them into the room. "We should really do this in the conservatory next year. Pearl, you come around here." This to the young blonde woman who'd made Quentin draw a map. "Now," he said when they were all inside. "Quentin, sit, please." Quentin was already sitting. He scooched in his chair a little farther. Dean Fogg took out of one pocket a fresh pack of cards, the plastic wrap still on them, and from the other he took a stack of nickels, maybe $1's worth, which he put down too emphatically so that they promptly slumped over. They both reached to restack them. "All right, let's get to it." Fogg clapped his hands and rubbed them together. "Let's see some magic." He sat back in his chair and folded his arms. Hadn't they already done this part? Quentin kept his face studiously calm and unworried, but his mind was in freefall. Slowly he unwrapped the stiff new cards, the plastic crackling deafeningly in the excruciating stillness, and watched from a mental mile away as his hands dutifully rifled and bridged them. Rifled and bridged. He searched his brain for a trick he hadn't already done the first time around. Somebody coughed. He'd already started his routine when Fogg stopped him. No. Fogg chuckled, not especially kindly. "Not like that. I want to see some real magic." He knocked twice on the hard tabletop with his knuckles and sat back again. Quentin took a deep breath and searched Fogg's face for the good humor he'd seen there earlier. But Fogg just watched expectantly. His eyes were a pale, milky blue, paler than eyes usually were. "I don't really get what you mean," Quentin said slowly in the silence, like he'd forgotten his line in the school play and had to ask for it. "What do you mean, real magic?" "Well, I don't know." Fogg shot a hilarious sideways glance at the other teachers. "I don't know what I mean. You tell me what I mean." Ugh. Quentin shuffled a couple more times, stalling. He didn't know what to do. He would do anything if they would just tell him what he was supposed to do. This was it, he thought. He was coming to the end. This is what failure feels like. He looked around the room, but every face was either blank or avoiding his gaze. No one was going to help him. He was going back to Brooklyn. Maddeningly, he could feel tears pooling in his eyes. He blinked them away. He so badly wanted not to care, but he was falling backward, sinking down inside himself, and there was nothing there to catch him. This is it, he thought. This was the test he couldn't pass. It wasn't really all that surprising. He just wondered how long they were going to let it go on. "Stop fucking with us, Quentin," Fogg barked. He snapped his fingers. "Come on, wake up!" He reached across the table and grabbed Quentin's hands roughly. The contact was a shock. His fingers were strong and strangely dry and hot. He was moving Quentin's fingers, physically forcing them into positions they didn't want to be in. "Like this," he was saying. "Like this. Like this." "Okay, stop," Quentin said. He tried to pull away. "Stop." But Fogg didn't stop. The audience shifted uncomfortably. And somebody said something. Fogg kept on working Quentin's hands with both of his, kneading them. He bent Quentin's fingers back, stretching them apart so that the webs between the fingers burned. Light seemed to flash between their hands. "I said stop it!" Quentin jerked his hands away. It was surprising how good the anger felt. It was something to grab onto. In the shocked silence that followed, he took a deep breath and forced it out through his nose. When it was out, he felt like he'd expelled some of his despair with it. He'd had enough of being judged. He'd been sucking it up his whole life, but even he had his limit. Fogg was talking again, but now Quentin wasn't even listening. He had begun to recite something under his breath, something familiar. It took him a second to realize that the words he was mouthing weren't English. They were from the foreign language he had invented earlier that afternoon. It was an obscure language, he'd decided, indigenous to a single tropical archipelago, a languorous hot-weather paradise, a Goguen painting, blessed with black sand beaches and breadfruit trees, and freshwater springs, and endowed with an angry, glowing red volcano god, and an oral culture rich of obscene expletives. He spoke this language fluently, with no accent, like a native. The words he spoke were not a prayer exactly, more of an incantation. Quentin stopped shuffling the cards. There was no going back. Everything snapped into very slow motion, as if the room had filled up with a vicious but perfectly clear liquid in which everyone and everything floated easily and calmly. Everyone and everything except for Quentin, who moved quickly, with two hands together, as if he were releasing a dove. He tossed the deck of cards lightly up to the ceiling. The deck broke apart and scattered in flight, like a meteorite losing cohesion in the atmosphere, and as the cards fluttered back down to earth, they stacked themselves on the tabletop. They formed a house of cards. It was a recognizable, if impressionistic, model of the building they were sitting in. The cards fell as if by chance, but each one perfectly snapping into place, magnetically, edge to edge, one after the other. The last two, the aces of spades and hearts, leaned up against each other to make the roof over the clock tower. Now the room was absolutely still. Dean Fogg sat as if he were frozen in place. All the hairs were standing up on Quentin's arms, but he knew what he was doing. His fingers left almost imperceptible phosphorescent trails behind them in the air. He definitely felt high. He leaned forward and blew slightly on the card house, and it collapsed back down into a neatly stacked deck. He turned the deck over and fanned it out on the table like a blackjack dealer. Every card was a queen. All the standard suits, plus other suits that didn't exist, in different colors, green and yellow and blue, the queen of horns, the queen of clocks, the queen of bees, the queen of books. Some were clothed, some were shamelessly naked, some of them had Julia's face, some of them had the lovely paramedics. Dean Fogg watched Quentin intently. Everybody watched him. Watched this. Quentin squared the deck again, and with no particular effort, ripped it in half, and then ripped the halves in half, and tossed the resulting confetti at the assembled company, who had flinched except for Fogg. He stood up. His chair fell over backward. "Tell me where I am," Quentin said softly. "Tell me what I'm doing here." He picked up the stack of nickels in his fist, only it was no longer a stack of coins. It was the hilt of a bright, burning sword that he drew easily out of the tabletop, as if it had been left there buried up to the hilt. "Tell me what's going on here," Quentin said louder to the room. "And if this place isn't Fillory, then for fuck's sake will somebody please tell me where the hell I am?" Quentin let the tip of the sword hover over Fogg's nose for a slow 10 count. Then he reversed his grip and stabbed it down into the wood of the table. The point bit deep into the buttery wood and stuck there. Fogg didn't move. The sword waggled in place. Quentin sniffled involuntarily. The last of the light of the window died. It was night. "Well now," the dean said finally. He removed a neatly folded handkerchief from his pocket and patted his forehead. "I think we can all agree that that was a pass." Somebody, it was the old guy with the knots, put a reassuring hand on Quentin's back and gently, with surprising strength, drew the sword out of the table and laid it safely on its side. A slow patter of applause arose from the assembled examiners. It quickly turned into an ovation. And that's where we'll end for today. We will see you guys next week with Chapter 3.